we'll start. So again, welcome to the AI and Faith Symposium on Chaplaincy Care and AI. Mark Graves, I'm the research director here. So today we will talk about, give an overview of chaplaincy care and the AI landscape, talk about challenges and opportunities, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions about that. So I'll make introductions and provide an overview of AI and some of its religious and ethical implications. Then David Fleenor is going to provide an overview of the field of chaplaincy, healthcare, and AI. And after a short break, Rabbi Weiner will moderate a discussion between Estelle Smith and Tracy Trothen. Then we'll have breakout discussions and a group reflection. Again, please stay muted. We're recording this, the video, with questions in the chat, and then we'll have discussion in the breakout rooms. First, a little bit about AI and faith. So our goal is we're a pluralist nonprofit that brings the wisdom of the world's religions to the AI ethics conversations. And today's symposium is one expression of that work. We were founded in 2018 among religious and academic institutions in the Pacific Northwest. Now we're a community of more than 220 interdisciplinary experts, technologists, ethicists, scholars, and clergy, more than 20 countries, with around 30 partner organizations. We are pluralist. We have resources and experts in Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Catholic, mainline, and evangelical Christianity, among others. And for most of part of our existence is for most of the world's population, then questions about AI and ethics are also not just moral, but spiritual. We put out a monthly newsletter, articles, podcasts. I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to sign up for the newsletter, subscribe to our podcast. We have cross-discipline interreligious discussions and projects, like this. We undertake academic research. We have, convenings, engage the media, develop curriculum, and have policy input. And we're comprised of several experts, including some of the people engaged here. The longer bios are on the registration page, but just briefly, after I talk, David Fleenor will present, and he's an Episcopal priest, healthcare chaplain, educator, researcher, and consultant whose work explores the intersection of spiritual care, healthcare, education, ethics, and emerging technologies. Estelle Smith is an assistant professor of computer science at the Colorado School of Mines, specializing in human-computer interaction, human-AI interaction, AI ethics, and digital spiritual care. Tracy Trothen is a professor of ethics at Queen's University in Canada, jointly appointed to the School of Religion and the School of Rehabilitation Therapy, and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Canada. They'll participate in Estelle and Tracy will participate in a panel that Weiner will moderate. He's the senior rabbi and executive director of spiritual care department at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, where he oversees the chaplaincy team and all spiritual care services across the healthcare system. And then again, I'm Mark Graves. I'm the research director at AI and Faith, also a research associate professor of psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary, and a visiting scholar at the University of San Francisco, Jesuit University here in San Francisco. Got degrees in computer science and theology, and I've worked in healthcare. So as we were putting together the panel, we realized people are going to be coming in with a variety of understanding of AI. And so before we move into the chaplaincy aspect, I'm going to talk a little bit, just some foundations of AI and some ethical and religious implications of that. I know for some of the people here, this will probably be kind of basic review, but there's also, but I realize for some people this is still fairly new technology. So I'll try and kind of split the difference. So the question, what is AI? So AI includes many technologies. So we tend to think of AI in terms of generative AI, but that's a smaller part of the whole scope of what's studied in terms of artificial intelligence, including machine learning, computer vision, overlaps with robotics. And so there's sometimes when people are talking about AI, they're talking about generative AI. Other times they're talking about the broader field or some aspects of it. And so one way to actually understand it is it's a field of study that's been around about 70 years, looking at a variety of topics. You could probably talk about it starting back in the 50s. I mean, computer science predated that, but computer science and AI were pretty tightly intertwined at first. The term was coined by John McCarthy in 19. One of the early applications was a therapy chatbot that called Eliza that Joseph Weizenbaum created. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but so the idea of chatbots have been around for like 60 years. And so there's a sense in which, although many of the issues are important because of the social implications, then this has been a new, there is a history to this. There's been, AI winters where there has not been much engagement with AI, interleaved with advances. Early on, when the thought was, intelligence was about problem solving, chess was seen as like the ultimate expression of what a machine could do. If we could get a machine to, play chess, then we'd kind of solved, intelligence. That didn't turn out to be, that happened in 97, wasn't enough. So with language or general knowledge, AI that could, win at Jeopardy, carry on a conversation. About 10 years ago, it started to get a little bit more serious. Whenever chess wasn't complex enough, then the game Go was seen as just something that AI would never be able to do. There were certainly predictions 20 years ago about AI never being able to play Go. Well, in 2015, then Google developed a system that was actually able to beat the world champion in this very complex strategy game. But then what was interesting is only 2 years after that, then another application was able to also become the stronger player, but without any teaching of Go. It knew the rules of the game and was able to play it itself. And that's significant whenever we start talking about like recursive self-improvement of AI, its ability to actually build itself. And so that kind of dates back only about a decade. It's also important when we talk about like the kind of GPT, the OpenAI, ChatGPT, to realize these large language models, they were around for a couple of years before people were really engaging with them. It was based upon a combination of technologies that I'll talk about in just a second. But there's also another way of looking at AI is, and what's the goal? What are people in AI research trying to do? Well, 4 goals that have kind of, are kind of within the textbook on AI. The goal could be to build a machine that thinks humanly, acts humanly, thinks rationally, or acts rationally. So thinking human is about, how does our brain work? How does our psychology work? Can we replicate that? Thinking rationally, it's, humans, maybe we're kind of limited. Maybe there's an ideal beyond that, that comes out of philosophy and logic. And it can be either very cognitive or it can be kind of more broader, including kind of affective and social, aspects. The goal could be to act humanly. Can a machine behave like an intelligent human? And then it could also try and act rationally, learn to do the right thing. Well, so generative AI, even though it's inspired the neural nets by what we've learned about thinking humanly, and even though it has ideals that kind of go beyond, the basic knowledge that goes into AI is human knowledge, straight from the internet. And so the goal there is to kind of act like a human. And that's an important thing whenever we consider some of its limitations, kind of what the goal is. So as I said, AI has been around for a while. So kind of, why now? Why the breakthrough over the past, 3 to 4 years? So the algorithms were there. They've been around, since the 90s. One of the things that happened was there's increased computing power, just the incremental improvement of the ability to do computation. There's also much more data available now than there was, 20, 30 years ago. And those turn out to be really kind of key factors. They're dependent also upon the ability to actually do kind of the cloud computing, the computing that occurs within these large data centers that are spread out, all over the world. And that allows access to high-powered computing, globally. And to actually connect these, then we needed kind of the high-speed internet. So there are a number of technologies that had to come together before we could actually get to where we are with generative AI. Now, I want to go a little bit into some technical detail on machine learning. So this is a kind of a broader field than generative AI. There are three groups of algorithms. There's kind of supervised machine learning, which are algorithms trained on labeled data. So you give a system, some input data, and what you want is a solution, and it learns to do that. So, for example, labeling images. There's unsupervised learning, which is trained on data without any labels to find patterns and relationships in the data. So, recommendation engines. So whenever you, sign into Netflix and start watching films, it learns to predict films that you might like based upon what other people who have liked similar films also ended up watching. If you actually do a thumbs up or a thumbs down, then it switches from unsupervised learning to supervised learning. You're giving it, that yes, you like that. You're adding information. Well, that works for incremental stuff, but over time, either as you interact with the system or, for example, robotics or vehicle, then there are certain goals, and the system can learn from those goals what takes it closer or further away from the goals. So early in machine learning, these were three different approaches, but one of the things that's happened with generative AI is it actually combines these approaches. And so it starts out with it's unsupervised, learning. It takes the data from the, websites, books, journals, and finds the patterns within that with no additional human input, just from the data. That gives a base, LLM. And so that's what like GPT-3 was back in, 2020. But that wasn't quite enough. And so what happened was they combined that technology with the ability to reinforce what would be following good instructions. And so the combination there is what gave us the ChatGPT and this kind of, in a sense, breakthrough that from many perspectives was kind of unexpected. And so when we talk about a large language model now, we're talking about, a base language model that has found patterns in the data that comes in, and then some reinforcement learning on what it means to provide good instruction, some fine tuning, especially like for domains such as healthcare. And what we end up with is, a predictive text, at scale. So on your phone or your email browser, or within a Google Doc, you may see it predict the next word. And so that's fundamentally the same kind of thing that's happening within a large language model. It's kind of this autocomplete supercharged. But instead of just predicting based upon what you say in text messages and other people say in text messages, it's trained on much of the internet. But it's still doing that prediction, one word or one piece of a word at a time. And so the key thing is that there's not a database of facts that it's looking up. It's actually just predicting from the training text. And so there's some, randomness in there. And so if you ask it to complete a sentence like the Lord is my blank, then because of the amount of material that's there from scriptures, it's going to, predict most of the time the Lord is my shepherd. And so it repeats that process over and over again. And it's gotten very, very good at it. it can now, predict things at a much larger scale, like a slide for, what would be a good slide for a presentation, rather than just, text. So, but by doing that, it means that what happens is going to be the most statistically likely continuation, not actually something that's true. And so an AI hallucination or confabulation is a polished, confident output that happens to be false. So for those of you that engage in dementia care, realize when people can't remember something, they'll try and make up something plausible. So they're just filling in gaps when they can't access their memory. Well, a large language model, in a sense, is in an analogous space. Although there are now common techniques to bring in specific data, the model itself doesn't, by itself, is only trying to fill in what is plausible. And so it generates what a good answer looks like. So, for example, if you ask, give me a peer-reviewed study showing chaplains' visits reduce patient anxiety, it's going to try and respond. It was reinforced to give a plausible response to that, not necessarily an accurate one. And so it will say, sure, provide a cited study, even if it has to completely make it up. And so it's very important in engaging with AI to realize that what it's doing is it's trying to predict something that is likely and that fits some general goal, but not necessarily something that's actually true. And so that also means, like, if you ask it to provide a caring response or a human response, then that also is something that is, in a sense, simulating what we might expect in terms of care. So going back to, the ELISA effect. So for Weizenbaum, whenever he when he built this very simple system, I mean, it was, even when I was in graduate school, it was a very simple homework assignment. But he was alarmed by how, people, like including his secretary, who would try and engage with it on a very personal way. There's the story is told that he was watching his secretary, and she was using ELISA, and she asked him to step away because she was having a conversation with ELISA that was so personal, she didn't feel like sharing that, and that alarmed him, and so he actually became a pretty harsh critic of AI. And today, that just happens at scale. So there's companion apps with tens of millions of users, brief bots that simulate the voice or text of the deceased, devotional and AI chaplain apps. And so that's a reality. So when people are coming in, they may have already engaged in these kind of relationships. But the important thing there is they're not optimized for care, they're optimized for engagement. They're optimized for some goal that's set by some for-profit company, not necessarily for care. And so this leaves us with questions. What's the technology for, and who decides? What happens to care when machines perform it? And which humans' behavior should we refuse to automate? And so we'll talk about these and other questions today. But first, I want to put this within a religious context also, because the Catholic Church and other religious organizations have been starting to take this seriously. And so, a little over 2 months, well, less than 2 months now, about 2 months ago, the Pope released an encyclical on artificial intelligence and humanity, on the anniversary of a document that's seen as kind of founding the Catholic Church's position on social teaching. And in that, he talks about things, how technology is never neutral, which is something that was known within, kind of philosophy of technology and well understood there, but not part of the kind of the public discourse. And he extended this 135-year-old teaching into the digital age. So it's like Pope Francis, kind of brought the Catholic Church in conversation with environmental issues. Pope Leo the 14th is actually bringing the Catholic Church in engagement with AI. And so he is actually the image that he, brought up is kind of Babel or Jerusalem. The idea, if you're familiar with the scripture, of building something that comes out of our, humanity's power and pride versus rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem after they were destroyed, and actually participating in kind of patient shared and participatory work. And so there it's calling people into kind of the construction sites to actually enter in and engage in this space that we're talking about today of care, of social teaching, of in the age of AI. And then finally, just to kind of tie it a little bit further into kind of chaplaincy, one of the things that the encyclical also talks about is kind of a theology of finitude, that everything that appears today as a limit, illness, old age, and suffering, tends to be treated as a defect to be corrected. But the encyclical holds a couple of commitments that we need to acknowledge this as a fundamental finitude. It's not something to be avoided, but it's something to be worked through. It's part of our existence. And as chaplains, live in that tension every day. And so how do you actually try to alleviate, the suffering and actually be present to the suffering kind of at the same time? Kind of three marks of, of a situation that probably should not be optimized away is, if it's open to relationship, it's where capacity can be learned, where it can change the person. An example is, if you're waiting with a grieving friend, then you're engaging in this kind of formative space of finitude and presence. Whereas if you're just waiting on hold, it doesn't have those marks. And so for chaplaincy, then you serve at these limits where an optimizing culture, the companies and the socio-technical patterns that are building AI systems be treated as defects, but that can help us to form these communities from these limits. And so that's kind of the Catholic perspective. But as that engages into the conversation, then it can inform the discussions that we're actually having. And so now I'm going to turn over to David Fleenor, who will give a little bit more specifics into this engagement of chaplaincy, care, and AI.